My name is Chris Thorogood. I am a botanist at the University of Oxford Botanic Garden, and it's my very great pleasure to be talking to you today about the weird, the wild, and the wonderful side of the plant kingdom. And before I do, I'd just like to answer the question, what does a botanist actually do? So a botanist is a plant biologist. We're interested in the science and the biology of plants. And I've always been fascinated by plants. I remember when I was a kid, I used to grow all sorts of unusual things on my bedroom windowsill, from pitcher plants, carnivorous plants, to cacti and succulents. And it's a passion that I've carried with me my whole life. And I feel very, very lucky and fortunate that I get to do what I love. And that is to work with plants every day. And my job takes me to some very beautiful places to see some lovely plants. This very beautiful place here is a little island in the Libyan Sea. It's warm, it's sunny, it's surrounded by lovely plants, and to be honest, I couldn't be happier than when I'm somewhere in the world like this. Sometimes my job takes me further afield. So this is Mount Tateyama in Japan, and I do a conservation project out in Japan, working with local botanists out there, and they take me to some lovely places. This mountain, Mount Tateyama, is particularly beautiful, and we stopped off up along the trail to the mountain summit, and we all wore bells to ward off bears, which can sometimes attack people there. And we saw all sorts of beautiful wild magnolias and rhododendrons, all with waterfalls in the background, and then eventually made our way to the snowy summit at the top, and it really was breathtakingly beautiful. And this is further south, also in Japan. This is in Shikoku, a lovely forested area where we've also done some conservation work, a team of botanists. This is the sort of work we do. So this is some botanical field work that we've done, vegetation surveys. So some of the work that we do is to understand which plants grow in a certain place, because until we understand what the plants are that are growing somewhere, and how important they are, for example, how rare they might be, it's very difficult for us to set priorities for conservation. Which areas should we conserve most importantly? And so that's some of the work that we do. And sometimes my job takes me to quite scary places. So this is a video I took on my phone a few weeks ago in the Canary Islands, which are off the coast of North Africa. It's a very beautiful place. I'll show that video again. And here we're looking for rare plants that grow high up on the cliff tops there. Isn't it extraordinary? So sometimes it helps to have a good head for heights to be a botanist as well. This is a volcanic island where there was an eruption shortly after I left. And I'm interested in the science of plants. And science, as you know, is about answering questions. Finding out about something, being curious. And so from an early age, I've looked at plants and thought, why are you like that? Why do you look like that? How do you work? And so a lot of my job now is working with other scientists to answer those questions. So here on the right, you can see a pitcher plant. It's a carnivorous plant, one that eats insects, and we'll see a few more of those later. And then on the left, I've shown a micrograph. So that's a photograph taken under a microscope, which shows the red slippery bit at the top in greater detail. Now, how this plant works is that insects are attracted to the bright red colours and the smell of sugary nectar, and they slide off this red slippery surface and tumble into the leafy trap, where they're broken down and digested and provide food for the plant. The plant grows in conditions where food such as nitrogen and phosphorus, which plants need to grow, is very scarce. And so that's why these plants have evolved to eat insects. But I'm interested in this slippery surface and how it works. And I'll come back to why in a second. But before I do, I'd like to show this interesting phenomenon. This is some water that I've dropped on a lotus leaf, and you'll notice that it beads, it forms beads and it rolls off. This is fascinating because this is a self-cleaning plant. So what happens is The surface repels water, so the water aggregates, it all joins together to form these bead-like droplets, and it rolls off and it takes the dirt as it does so. And this has been the inspiration for self-cleaning paint and self-cleaning glass. So a lot of the things that we're used to in everyday life actually come from plants originally. And so this slightly blurry video is one that we took of an insect sliding on the slippery surface of a pitcher plant. And working with engineers and mathematicians, we've looked more closely at how insects slide off the trap and into the pitcher, into the plant. And we think that there might be applications for technology in industry for manipulating how water travels on slippery surfaces. And so we can actually be inspired in industry by the surfaces of plants, which I think is really, really exciting. I'm also interested in art and the connections between art and science. I've always loved painting and drawing, and it's something that I love to combine with my passion for plants. So this is me painting a pitcher plant that I've seen in the wild in Borneo. And I'll come back to this particular plant in a little while. Now, before I take you through some of my favourite weird and mysterious plants, because I know that's what you want to hear, I just wanted to touch upon this one. Perhaps you've heard of it. This is a mandrake. Mandrakes feature in the Harry Potter books. And whenever I tell people that mandrakes are real, they say, really? I thought they were imaginary or fictional and magical. They are in fact real plants. I've taken a photograph of one on the right. And if you were to dig one up, you'd find that it has this thick fleshy root that looks a little bit like the shape of a person, as you can see in the image on the left there. And it was thought long ago that that was symbolic and that this plant was indeed magical. The plant has very strong chemical properties. So it's a narcotic, which means it sends you to sleep. And it was used as a sort of makeshift anesthetic long ago, before we have the anesthetic that we use for operations today. And so this plant was thought of as very special because it has a root shaped like a person and it has all these important chemical properties. And it was thought that if you were to dig one out of the ground, it would scream, and if you heard that scream, then it would kill you. And so it was believed that the only way to safely harvest a mandrake was to tie it to a dog under moonlight, to entice the dog with a piece of meat, and then the dog would yank the mandrake out of the soil, and then the evil spirit that the mandrake was thought to contain would be transferred to the dog rather than to the person. I've always had a fascination for weird plants. I said a moment ago that I love to paint, and I'm never happier than when I'm painting weird plants in my little studio at home, recreating some of the magic that I've seen with these beautiful plants in the wild. And so today I want to talk in a little more detail about some of these weird and mysterious plants. Here is a selection of botanical oddities. These are pen and ink diagrams that I've created for scientific papers, but really just to show you how extraordinary some of these plants can be. They really, I think, challenge our perception of what a plant is. We tend to think of plants as very beautiful, something we grow in our garden, maybe house plants, but there's a whole other world to plants out there. These extraordinary plants, some of which have evolved to steal their food from other plants, like the ones you're seeing in front of you now, and some that trap and kill insects. I'd like to start off with this one. This is the largest single flower in the world. This is Rafflesia. Isn't it extraordinary? It grows to well over 1 meter across. It only grows in the rainforests of Southeast Asia, particularly in Sumatra and Borneo. And it produces these giant cabbage-like buds that you can see on the left. And then when they're ready, they unfurl and produce these enormous flowers. This is a particularly weird plant because it's a vampire. And what I mean by that is that it steals its food by sucking the sap out of the roots of other plants. And you'll see it has no leaves, it also has no roots and no stems. and it feeds off of the vines that you can see I've painted there in the background. And it lives inside the tissues of the vines, its so-called host plant, steadily stealing its food, and then eventually when it's ready, it erupts through the surface of the rainforest floor with these giant blossoms. I should say as well that they smell absolutely horrendous. So this giant vegetable vampire is actually pollinated by flies. So it smells like a rotting animal. It produces this dreadful stench, and it looks a bit like rotting meat as well. And that's very attractive to flies, which crawl inside the flower, pick up pollen, and cross-pollinate the plant. The next weird plant I'd like to show you grows here. So this is a photograph of the Karoo Desert that I trekked across a few years ago in South Africa. It's very, very hot. It's a very beautiful. And this grows there. This is my painting of Hydnora africana. Isn't it extraordinary? This is probably the weirdest plant I know. It's not particularly large. I think my painting makes it look bigger. It's about half the length of your arm, and it erupts through the floor of the desert and produces these extraordinary mouth-like flowers that even seem to have teeth. And these ones, like Rafflesia, smell horrible. They smell a bit like animal dung, and that's very attractive to dung beetles. That when they're going about their business, walking through the desert, they come across a Hydnora flower and they tumble in, and then they pick up pollen. And that's what the plant wants. It wants to manipulate these insects into spreading its pollen. The next one I'd like to show is probably one that you're familiar with. This is, of course, a Venus flytrap. And who has not been fascinated by the formidable jaws of a Venus flytrap at some point in their lives? It really is a predator among plants. It produces these leafy jaws that are like a barbed snare, and anything that crawls through them becomes trapped in this leafy barbed snare, which then feeds the plant because it grows in waterlogged swamps around Carolina, where it benefits from eating particularly insects, though in this case I've painted an unfortunate lizard being eaten, which it can sometimes consume as well. This is a photograph of a sundew, which is actually a relative of the Venus flytrap, and you can see there the dead remains of a fly that this sundew has caught. It grows where I work, at the Botanic Garden in Oxford. And you can see the leaf is covered in these tentacles with these little droplets of glue. Now insects find these droplets irresistible and they land on the leaf, and then the tentacles curve inward very slowly over a period of about 5 minutes, so slower than a Venus flytrap. And they force themselves in over the body of the fly, suffocating it, covering it in glue, and then digesting the soft parts. So again, this is another very hungry plant. These, again, you might be familiar with. These are North American pitcher plants. This one is called Sarracenia flava, or the trumpet pitcher. And it has these red splodges, and it produces nectar, which is very attractive to flies and ants. And these insects, they eat the nectar, and it actually contains a drug, a chemical substance called conine, which makes the insects drowsy and intoxicated. And that means they're more likely to lose their footing on the slippery rim and tumble in where they're digested by the plant. Now this is a photograph inside a pitcher plant. I'm fascinated by these plants. And they're really quite beautiful, I think. So this is the slippery part called the peristome that I showed you earlier, that I've been looking at with some engineers. And then at the bottom you can see a pool of digestive liquid. That's what the insects fall into and drown. But there are some interesting plants that have changed the theme somewhat, so they no longer feed on insects. This one is called Nepenthes lowii, and it grows in the mountains in Borneo. And these little tree shrews, these furry guys, they crawl onto the pitcher and they feed on the nectar in the spoon-like lids that you can see flexed back on the left of the pitcher. And as they feed on it, they basically poo inside the pitcher. And that's a wonderful source of manure that feeds the plant. And this is another example, a giant one that does a similar thing. This is the king pitcher plant, and I have to say this is one of my favourite plants of all. I've seen this on Mount Kinabalu in northern Borneo, and it produces these enormous leafy traps. They're about a foot long, really, really huge. Here is my painting of one growing on Mount Kinabalu. And just like the previous example of a pitcher plant, this one is also used by tree shrews as a toilet. They clamber onto the pitcher, they cling onto that spiky looking red part, the rim, and they lick the nectar off the inner surface of the lid at the top. And as they do so, they go to the toilet in the pitcher, and this is an invaluable source of nutrients for the plant. It's ingenious. Here's another painting of one I've done. You can see I really like these plants, and I seem to paint one every year, to be honest. This is a bat pitcher plant, another species of Nepenthes that grows in the heath forests of Borneo. And this time a bat makes its home inside the pitchers. So the bats are attracted to the pale colour of the pitcher. They crawl inside, and you can just about see that ridge on the outside of the pitcher. They cling onto that, and they roost inside there, so it's a safe place for them to rear their young. They're protected from predators, and all through the day they urinate. They basically go to the toilet inside this pitcher, and that creates a source of nutrients again for the plant. This is an Aristolochia, or a birthwort, and the strange part in the middle is actually mimicking a toadstool or a fungus. And this one is attractive to fungus gnats, so little flies that like to lay their eggs on fungi in the rainforest. And they're attracted to this strange fungus-like structure, which also smells like a fungus. And as they do so and look for a place to lay their eggs, they pick up pollen, and so they cross-pollinate the flower. These guys are bee orchids. These are photos of plants that I saw in the Mediterranean a couple of years ago. And they look and smell like a female insect, and male insects are attracted to the flowers and they try to mate with them, and as they do so, they become very confused, and in their vigorous attempts to mate with the flowers that they think is a female insect of their species, they pick up and deliver pollen for the plant. This one is a flying duck orchid, an extraordinary looking orchid that grows in Australia. And it works in a similar way. So male flies, sawflies, are attracted to what they think is a female, and as they try to fly off with her, to mate with her, they're flung into the reproductive parts of the flower. So these orchids are really manipulating their pollinators. I wanted to show this extraordinary fruit. It's called a durian, and it's highly prized in Southeast Asia, less so in the Western world. I can't say I have much of a taste for it. It's a sort of custardy-like yellow flesh inside that some people love, but it produces this terrible smell that is a bit like drains, and so much so that you're banned from actually having them in some parts of Southeast Asia. You can't travel with them, for example. And that's acting as a signpost to tell animals far and wide in the rainforest that the fruit is ripe and it's ready to be eaten. And then these animals and birds eat the flesh, the yellow part, they swallow the seeds, and then they distribute the seeds of the plant far and wide. And this is me with a durian that I took recently to a lecture I gave in Cambridge and shared a room with, and I can tell you it's not pleasant. I wanted to show this very beautiful seed. I took a long time trying to choose the right colour blue when I painted this, and I wanted to explain why it is this very vibrant colour. So this is a Strelitzia relative called a ravenella. So its common name is a traveller's palm, and it grows in Madagascar. And on Madagascar, there are not so many birds that would be able to distribute the seeds as do its relatives in southern Africa. But there are lots of lemurs, animals that can see very well in the colour spectrum of green and blue. And so this seed has this edible blue part around it that the lemurs are attracted to. And this seed is saying, here I am, I'm ready to be eaten, and please spread me. And so there's a very good reason that this seed is this particular vibrant shade of blue. The last plant I wanted to share with you is something quite sad, but it's something I feel very passionately about. I've shown different forms of pitcher plants in my talk, And some of them we've only discovered how the biology of these plants work very recently. So the bat pitcher plant and the tree shrews, these are things that have been discovered in my lifetime. We didn't know that they had these incredible interactions with animals until quite recently, a few years ago. This is my painting of a different species. It's called Nepenthes extincta. And I'm sad to say that the only thing that exists of this plant anymore is a dried up herbarium specimen. So that's a bit like a museum for plants, a pressed plant that's in London in Kew Gardens. And my painting of it, there really is nothing else left of this plant because the place it grows in Mindanao in the Philippines, you can see a picture of it below, has really been cleared of all its rainforest because it's one of the world's largest nickel mining sites now. And I think that's really, really sad because the plant and all the amazing stories that might have come with it have been lost forever. And so really, if there's something that I'd love for you to take away from my talk, it's that plants are fascinating, they're really interesting, they're worth caring about and they're worth conserving. And I really hope that a new generation of botanists will really find these plants as fascinating as I have. And let's go out there and conserve these wonderful plants for many generations to come. Thank you.